From the Sky News Centre, this is Paul Murray Live.
Thank you so much, Shari. Always a great show. Make sure you stick with us all the way through to Rita Panihi, who now has her own show, 4 nights a week, 11 p.m. So get ready to watch that. If you happen to just say that might be too late, make sure you catch it up on demand or record it on your Series IQ. But make sure you're back in Rita, the Persian princess. We love her very much. Now, strength and love particularly to the people in the Grampians region, a region of Victoria. They are still recovering from the bushfire that's been there over the past couple of days. There's a particular part I want to shout out, though, which is Pomonal. And this is an area that's got just about 356 people in it. It's about 3 and a bit hours out from Melbourne, and it's part of the Grampians. Well, they suffered the bulk of the bushfire, and many properties have been destroyed, and also in this area there's been a loss of life. Now today there was footage that was being released via the Herald Sun about just how devastating this particular fire was. Now it is a later bushfire season, but it seems to still have all of the impact that it would be if it was right at the height of summer. Instead it's towards the end of summer, but the victims of all of this, well, they've lost an awful lot. Now the locals, of course, will have to do their bit to try to rebuild, but again, as always, when there is natural disaster and something bad happens to our fellow Aussies, we give them the spotlight.
There was a bit of a roar and embers coming down before we left. So there would have been spot fires everywhere, trees catching light. It's hard to take, but as I said, we've got our arms around each other and the bond is strong.
Now, the Premier of Victoria has also offered her thoughts.
There is some priority being given, obviously, to the community of Pomonal, so the rapid assessments are being undertaken there. There are people who spent last night in a relief centre not knowing if they've got a home to go back to today.
But there is a story that is connected to all of this. It's one I've spoken about in the past, but it's one that has come back as a result of what Victoria is dealing with right now. And it's something that the Fire Brigade Union and its representative are trying to call attention to, which is that there are massive problems in Victoria right now with the equipment that the Victorian government gives firefighters to be able to fight fires. The United Firefighters Union boss has said on Tuesday that the state government needed to address the catastrophic state of firefighting resources, which pose untold risk to the community and firefighters. About 60 fire trucks in the metropolitan Melbourne area, about more than 15 years old. They've got cracked doors, old engines and rusted roofs. More than half of the truck's fleet have passed their use-by date and continuously fail in operations. They are removed from service only to be put back in service because there are no replacements. Bit hard for the people who fight the fires to do it with old equipment. Peter says the situation is so catastrophic that on a day-to-day basis, Fire and Rescue Victoria faces the current problem of being unable to keep critical frontline appliances on the road without faults or failures. Now again, we talk about this a lot, what politicians do versus what they say. And they all love standing up there and giving the press conferences pretending that they are the ones who are in charge of the emergency response. Reality is that they're often emceeing these press conferences with the real people who know the information, or they're simply reading off a collection of notes. They don't know what's going on. But one thing they absolutely have control of is how they spend taxpayers' money. And if the Fire Brigade Union, which is a fairly left-wing union, is telling us that there's problems with the equipment, can somebody somewhere in the Victorian government actually buy new equipment? Stop finding excuses to recycle and send it out, because we don't want a scenario where, God forbid, a firefighter ends up dying and it's a coroner who ends up having to learn what the Firefighters Union, and we've been telling you for some time, watch what they do, not what they say. Meantime, about those power losses, which are still quite significant across big parts of Victoria. Now, of course, as you know, the towers fell over, which meant the transmission lines went out, but equally so, The over-reliance on a grid that hasn't been built to replace it means we're in a scenario where still about 174,000 people don't have power tonight. If you're watching us, you're obviously doing so via something powered by batteries, and we appreciate that you have tuned in, including anyone who's watching us right now on Sky News Regional, however you can do that. The wild weather resulted in the physical collapse of 6 transmission towers. Crews are actively working to restore the power in these affected areas. However, given the extent of the widespread damage, it may take weeks, we are hearing, for it to be restored. Meantime, there's another idea that came out of some bushfires that were in Western Australia while most of the country, and certainly the media, was on holidays. There were some particularly bad bushfires that were there and were a national show, so we'll talk about all parts of the country. And there was a really interesting idea that was raised today out of some of the difficulties that happened in those fires in Western Australia. Now, the suggestion is that people who have some form of a disability or are people who are considered to be vulnerable, that somebody needs to check in on them when things like the massive power outage that's happening right now in Victoria, has happened in places like Western Australia, happens into the future. Now, obviously, we would all hope that there's a family member or a neighbour who ends up knocking on the door. But interesting story from this one bloke in particular. His name is Gary Paul. And Gary is a man who suffers with vision difficulties, I believe, is legally blind. But he has suggested that there should be literally a list put together of vulnerable people in any community so that some form of an authority, when the power goes out, will be able to go and check that these people are okay. And Gary says, they didn't know about me being legally blind and can't drive. Across the whole community, there's a hole. We've got to look at it, mainly focusing on vulnerable people. Now, he's in Kalgoorlie. Now, apparently, the Kalgoorlie Local Council has no plans to put the list together, but someone somewhere should be putting lists like this together because, again, while we'd all love to believe that it's our neighbours that'll be there for us, there are people who are largely left alone, and in a disaster scenario or when the power goes out for a few hours, somebody like Gary needs someone to double check and make sure that he is okay. So it's a good idea, and one that I hope local councils, if that's the group, start putting those lists together sooner rather than later. Now, last night I told you that 53% of Australians, despite all of the noise in the political media, have virtually no or absolutely no knowledge about the too little too late tax changes that this government has introduced to try to save their bacon. Now, the numbers are so small it's not going to change anyone's life, but it's about changing their politics. So what's going to happen? Well, enter other people's money, the favourite source of money from governments who want to prop up their own political fortunes. And today there was a Senate estimates hearing where Katie Gallagher, the Finance Minister, was forced to reveal just how much money is going to be spent of taxpayers' money to tell other taxpayers that the too little too late tax cuts are much bigger than they actually are.
I think it's we've agreed. I think the decision of government is to agree to a campaign of up to $40 million over 2 financial years in relation to the tax campaign. But that hasn't been finalised.
I couldn't help but think that the Finance Minister was in an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm and she's realised, oh, I said the thing I'm not supposed to.
I think it's we've agreed. I think the decision of government is to agree to a campaign of up to $40 million over 2 financial years in relation to the tax campaign. But that hasn't been finalised.
Thank you, Larry. Now, let's get to just the size of this amount of money which is being spent totally for politics, right? There is literally no other reason that you need to be told about tax. Remember, it's a relationship between you, your boss, the tax department, and then you'll be able to see your tax return at another point in time. But $40 million to spin the political nature of the too little too late tax changes is pretty offensive. In fact, the opposition was briefing people today that is more money than they spent advertising the NBN back when they were last in government in 2012 and 13. That was $21 million. It's twice as much to tell people they're getting a $14 a week tax cut. The Gonski reforms in education, well, they spent $15 million telling everyone how amazing that was. They're spending $40 million on the too little, too late tax changes. And then even when they said there wouldn't be a carbon tax and then there was a carbon tax, well, of course, they had to advertise about a carbon tax, and that was $12 million. So literally double the amount of money on the carbon tax, virtually double on education, and definitely double the amount of money that they spent to pitch their own NBN. Let me save the government $40 million. The tax cuts are 4/5 of bugger all. Now, while they will try to tell you what you will save annually, the reality is that you don't pay your tax annually. You pay it whenever you get paid. You pay it by the week, by the fortnight, or by the month. The reality for people in Australia, and yes, I'm going to show it again, is that if you earn $45,000, forget what the ads tell you, you will be saving a grand total of $15 a week. You will be able to keep $15 a week of your own money. Labor MPs told that this was the solution to cost of living. That's why I call it too little, too late. And even if you're somebody on $40 a week, let's be honest, $120 a month is not going to be anything when it comes to, say, paying off your mortgage, which you know is tens of thousands of dollars more than it was thanks to the interest rates that have gone up under this bloke's watch. Quite rightly, the concern of most Australians is that this government doesn't really have its heart into the protection of our borders and doesn't really have its heart in trying to return the people who were removed by the High Court, who were in indefinite detention because of laws that they had broken, things they had done in their past and the threats that they presented to the community. You know by now that the full list has been released of the number of people who the government knew, by the way, the day that they decided to send all out the door, rather than just the one bloke who was able to get a ruling out of the High Court, that 72 have been convicted of assault, violent offending, kidnapping or armed robbery, 37 had form as sexual-based offenders, including child sex offending, 16 had domestic violence charges, 13 had serious drug offending, and 7 were in for murder or attempted murder. But one thing that has become incredibly clear, and it was last year when they were dealing with it, and it has been this year when they've been having to deal with it again because the data they tried to hide has now been revealed. Remember when it was, oh, look, we think it's about 12, maybe 32, maybe 36? Well, I just read you the full list of the problems that have now been released into our community. You have a scenario where the opposition has gone straight for the immigration minister because they know his heart is well and truly not in punishing these people.
Has the government now contacted all of the victims of the crimes committed by the 149 criminals it released from immigration detention?
On what basis did the minister claim they are being continuously monitored?
How can the minister claim they are being continuously monitored if, in fact, they've been left to their own devices to commit crimes?
Which, of course, many are accused of doing, with many being taken back into some sort of police situation, but obviously many of them are not in custody at all. The concern for Australians is that a left-wing member of the Labor Party, who has previously had very obviously anti-closed border positions, both as a shadow minister and then again as the bloke who has responsibility for our borders. This was the bloke who knew that this decision was on its way, the bloke who released people without the correct visas, the bloke who promised electronic bracelets, but as we know, because we showed you the stories at the time, they were literally just dropped off at local hotels and allowed to do whatever the heck they want, and there was no security whatsoever. But it's Andrew Giles' performance in the Parliament every single day that shows just how not up to it this bloke is, not to mention his more senior minister, the clueless Claire O'Neill.
In the time following the High Court's decision, the Department put in place a mechanism that would enable victims to be contacted. Obviously, there are some issues around personal privacy and other questions that need to be addressed in that, but it was very important we put in place such a mechanism. The location of every individual in this cohort is known. Every individual's location is known. And unlike those opposite, I want to reassure Australians.
Honestly, these people You know what the reality here is, that they thought all of this was in the rearview mirror. We all knew because we saw it. And we learnt this week that they haven't even made one application to return any of the people that have been released to go back into detention, despite the form that I have just spoken about. But as we know, the only spin that counts is the spin that the Prime Minister's office has to put onto everything, that every Labor minister and backbencher and supporter has to put on everything, which is, when all else fails, blame Peter Dutton. And there was a perfect example of that this morning when Tanya Plibersek was on with my dear friend and buddy Laura Jays. Here's the first example of when all else fails, blame Dutton.
They've created the mess. We're cleaning it up. They should get on board and help instead of the constant incompetence and sniping from the sideline. We've now seen multiple reports about the way Peter Dutton managed the immigration portfolio when he had responsibility for it.
She then, of course, goes on to have the hide that somehow, despite the fact that she is obviously trying to score a political point against the former Home Affairs Minister, she is obviously trying to further the blame Dutton strategy out of the Prime Minister's office. She claims it's the Liberal Party that's politicising this.
Showing that contracts were let to companies that had links with organised crime, with people trafficking, with breaking Iran sanctions. I mean, he presided over a broken Home Affairs department. We're cleaning up the mess that he left. And instead of working with the government, you see this sort of behaviour, trying to politicise the crisis that they've contributed to.
Politicising the crisis. It's all Peter Dutton's fault, despite the fact that this government knew for months and months and months that one of two options was going to happen in the High Court. Despite the fact that they could have prepared a system, if the High Court decision didn't go their way, that they would have been able to make sure that if they had to release people, I'd say do it one by one, make each and every one of them have to go to the High Court. Instead, they let them all out. They let them all out, some of them with no visas. That's the reporting of the ABC, by the way, not a right-wing fever dream. Their own admission is that in the early days, the people that were supposed to have the ankle bracelets didn't. They then rushed a whole bunch of laws through the Parliament that the opposition had to clean up. They then tried to reassert that unless the opposition joins us this afternoon, they're protecting pedophiles. And the very own system that they pushed through the Parliament, that was perfected and cleaned up by Peter Dutton and his team, is one that created a scenario where the government could apply for these people to be put back into detention. Not one application has been made. And then there's the final example of when all else fails, blame Dutton.
You know, Laura, at least in part, I really believe this is because they don't want to be talking about the tax cuts that the government is giving. They know that this is the thing that's top of mind for most Australians, and they're looking for anything to distract from it.
Seriously. The too little too late tax cuts is the reason why the government is being held to account for their own failures in the protection of the citizens. Seriously. What do we always say? Pull the other one. It plays jingle bells. Fair income. Now, I understand what this strategy is, and I understand that the vast bulk of the press gallery is going to try to take the message from the dirt unit that we know the Prime Minister has and try to, when all else fails, blame Dutton. But how do the ministers that are responsible for the response to the High Court decision that happened during their time in office, that they argued, and remember, of course, the absurdity of the Attorney-General is that in part he was allowing the Human Rights Commission to argue on the behalf of the pedophiles, so they were literally funding both sides of the case. Fair income. But alas, this is the politics that we live in right now. But be very careful with these people because they're very slippery. They think that they are able to use your money to change the political conversation. And what about this little thing about the government is giving? The government's not giving anything. The government is allowing you to keep $15 a week. And we're supposed to be thankful. Drop to your knees. And $40 million of taxpayers' money is going to be spent to try to distract you that it is something other than $15 a week. Plenty more aggro in the tank on that one, I promise you. Now, despite the fact that Australia in every single state, repeat, every single state, didn't just vote no, but voted hell no to the voice, they rejected. Its arguments, they rejected. The people who were pushing it, and that was very clear in the referendum last year. We now learn today that the federal government is trying to get around the people who voted no and start to go after their kids or grandkids. The Indigenous Affairs Minister is now talking about a thing called truth-telling, which was one of the 3 demands of the Uluru Statement. Treaties apparently will be dealt with by the states, but truth-telling, which of course is only the black armband version of things, that this will now become part of the curriculum in our schools. The curriculum that will go from the earliest of education all the way through to your ability to do 4-unit truth-telling, presumably, in your Year 12 exams. Here she was this morning on the radio with Auntie PK.
The issue of truth-telling is incredibly important, and there are many ways in which that can happen, including school curriculum.
Let's be clear. Their plan here is that slowly but surely the people who resist what they want to do will just die out. And the people who are fed only one diet of information, they will end up seeing the world as they see the world, and they will vote the way that they want them to vote. That's the plan. All the time, every time. Feel free to push back, and you can do so if you're anywhere near Dunkley or any chance to vote at any time into the future. Now, let's also talk about other people's money, but this time when it comes to state governments. Now, for some reason, there is an obsession that the public service needs to pay people a wage that would be similar to a private company because we want the best people to work for us. Well, guess how many people earn more money than the Premier of New South Wales who work for the New South Wales government? 166. 166. The iCare CEO, a bloke called Richard Harding, he's being paid $1 million. That's essentially a state-owned insurance scheme. The bloke who runs Sydney Water is paid $817,000. The bloke who runs Essential Energy is on $814,000. The former Labor minister, who has been appointed to be the boss of the Independent Commission Against Corruption, ICAC, is paid $796,000, all of this way above what the Premier earns. The bloke who is the Coordinator General of Transport New South Wales, $700,000. The Police Commissioner, $679,000. The secretaries in lots of other departments, $623,000. Seriously. Now, again, the idea that we must pay people more than the Premier to administer the administrative state that is supposedly going to take its orders from the Premier sets up a rather obvious power dynamic, doesn't it? Where much of the people that are earning this money will continue to earn this money regardless of whom the Premier is, regardless of who the Minister is, regardless of what the government is. And this is a huge problem. Now, there are going to be specialist areas like potentially things like power companies, utilities, where some very specialist information is needed to run those companies. But the idea that the Police Commissioner needs to earn more money than the Premier, what is the competing sector? What is the private sector from which the Police Commissioner would otherwise be working? The Police Commissioner always comes from the police force. The head of the various departments, they should be paid no more than their ministers. And just in case you're not following my vibe, I am not suggesting a pay rise for the ministers. You see, when public servants get to decide how much other public servants are paid, they have the self-interest in pretending that that number has to go higher and higher and higher. It's what Republicans refer to as the deep state, because regardless of the politicians coming and going, they stay forever. You know how difficult it is to fire a high-profile public servant? Or let alone one of the other, 166 people who earn more money than the Premier? Of course, the Premier can be sacked in an afternoon if they lose the majority support of their party route. If the government becomes frustrated with most of these people, they're stuck with them. And they're certainly stuck with the people who were signed up to these ridiculous amounts of money who were signed up by the previous government. It's one of the many tactics governments do who know they're about to lose, which is to leave a whole bunch of human landmines behind, which is the public service that will not do what you want them to do, despite the fact that you are the one that won an election. And speaking of, Tasmania is off to an election. They will be there on March the 23rd. Hopefully we'll be able to be across it in some way, shape or form. No doubt Sky News will, as we previously have done things like People's Forum, and we'll try to bring you all of the information because, again, this is a national channel. The Tasmanian Premier, he decided to go today because his government had been put into deep minority and the two people who were somewhat propping it up, well, their demands were only getting louder. So he decided it's time to pull the pin and please, Tasmania, give me another majority.
I'm not going to allow myself or my government to be held to ransom for the next 12 months. It's bad for Tasmania and it's bad for Tasmanians. So I've taken the decision to call an election so that Tasmanians can have their say.
Now, again, I'm not going to pretend that I'm all across every single detail of Tasmanian politics, but one thing that is really obvious is that the Liberal Party has been returned many times. In fact, at the last two state elections, they got a majority. Tasmanians seemingly did not like the idea of minority governments, and certainly previously minority governments that were Labor and Greens. But the numbers you need in the Parliament are interesting to note here. Now, under the previous Parliament, you only needed 13 MPs to get a majority. That's what the Liberal Party had, followed by Labor, Green and the Independents. The former two Liberals who became the crossbench, well, they were the ones who did so because of the decision of the Tasmanian government to get in bed with the Albanese government to build a brand new stadium for a Tasmanian AFL team. And as the Tasmanian AFL deal that we have spoken about at some detail, it ain't a pretty one for Tasmanian taxpayers. In fact, Jeremy Ratcliffe, the Premier, released, finally, the signed agreement with the AFL. I highlighted the last line for you because apart from anything else, apart from the cost of the stadium, apart from the cost of hiring lots of other people, the people of Tasmania are going to have to spend money on this club every single year on propping it up. In fact, they are going to spend $21 million every single year for the next 10 years to make sure that the club remains financially viable. Oh, and by the way, at the end of that, if it's not, the AFL can close the franchise and take it back. Interesting politics. If this issue is one that you presume is going to hurt the Liberal Party, well, won't it hurt the Labor Party as well? You see, they've got the same leader who has lost multiple elections, who's had very bad political positions that the people of Tasmania have rejected twice before. But she, of course, is a Labor figure. So is she going to come out against a stadium that the federal government is already saying that they are going to pay for, that the Tasmanian government has already signed a document for? It'll be fascinating to see. And also another little quirk here is that the threshold to qualify for a seat in the Tasmanian Parliament, it lowers. You see, they don't have a scenario where one person, one electorate. They have multiple people representing lots of different electorates. And now by expanding the number of people in the Parliament to 35, they have lowered the threshold for who will now qualify as elected to the Tasmanian Parliament. So, Tasmania, here's your choices. The bloke who's going to lock you into financially supporting an AFL team that the AFL can take away from the state, an opposition leader you have rejected because of their far-left policies twice before, or a menagerie of independents who, of course, will end up changing your state. Whatever happens at this state election, can the winner please have a majority? Quick break, back with more. Lots to talk about this evening. We will do so in a moment with Christy McSweeney, Joe Hildebrand and Megyn Kelly joins us tonight. She was on fire when we had a chance to chat. I look forward to showing it to you in a moment or two's time. Let's get into a great debate now. Christy McSweeney joining us as always, and the wonderful Joe Hildebrand is here as well. Lovely to see you both.
Lovely to be here.
Of course, Christy with the PR Council and the man who is none other than... with the Daily Telegraph, Sky
That's
News,
right.
So much more.
Frank and fearless, fair and balanced.
Look, it feels like I do this to you every week, but I'm going to anyway. The federal government is going to give people on $45,000, $15 a week.
Yep.
But because the Essential poll yesterday tells us 52% of people have no idea about these things whatsoever, we need to be publicly educated.
That's right.
And that's why the taxpayer will now be paying $40 million for as a response to the cost of living crisis, the Australian government is giving you more of your money.
That's right. Out of the goodness of its own heart, in the spirit of community fairness and public goodwill, the government is prepared to spend $40 million of its/our money to tell us how good a job it is doing. And I think it's fantastic. I got a little flyer in the letterbox, just say with Linda Burney's face on it, because we're in her electorate, and it said, Labor's tax cuts, what you get, and it goes up. And it's more than $15 if you're on, obviously, more money. I'm getting about $4.5 grand a year, I think, which is about $4.5 grand less than I was going to get. But I'm happy to, like the government, I'm prepared to make that sacrifice for the greater good.
This is terrible. It is. You know, this is terrible.
It is brilliant politics.
It's garbage.
It's working a treat, and the punters just love it out there.
The punters just love it. Oh, I hate the punters.
I can tell you.
Punters are normal people are voters, and thank goodness they're watching right now. Yep. Christy, every opposition, before they become the government, we hate the amount of taxpayer advertising that's overtly political. This is going over 2 financial years because they're taking out the insurance, whether the federal election is this year or next year, to give themselves the options. But $40 million to tell people that a too little, too late tax cut is really a $4,000 drop all at once is going to be fun to see whether the Teals back that in as truth in advertising.
Well, it's incredible, isn't it? And the government calls it public information campaign, and there's rules around what you can communicate government policy in a language that doesn't mean it's politicised. But of course, we know it is. And as we said, we get it with our MPs messaging in it, except not my MP, which is Josh Burns in Macnamara. I think he'd keep his distance from the Labor Party at the moment, on the knife edge that he is with the Greens there in Macnamara.
Correct.
But look, I'm a communications agency director. Joe's a journalist. I think there is no media campaign in the history of Australia that was offering up $40 million for communications people to go and tell that message. If there is, I can tell you it will be preferred agency after preferred agency after preferred agency sitting there in Canberra telling bureaucrats what's going to resonate with the public. Everybody is in the trough on this one. $40 million. That's a lot of money.
Worth pointing out, I just thought I'd check it, but worth pointing out that the Howard government, more than 20 years ago, a quarter of a century ago, more than that even, almost 3 decades ago, spent $35.5 million at least of taxpayer money on the GST, on promoting or explaining the GST.
And guess what? Look, that obviously a more substantive change, but still, you know what? I agree. Too much money, right? See, this is the thing. I'm not going to argue that when Team Blue piddles taxpayers' money away, it's awesome, and when Team Red does it, it's bad. I'm saying that we have, as part of the interrelated relationships, like the media that'll be the beneficiaries of the advertising through to the people who make it and the government that gets the political hit out of it, I'm just saying it ain't public information, all right? It's not an education campaign. It is overtly political, and it's going to be the Australian government and cost of living said about as many times as possibly they can. But the reality is, to the people who need it the most, $15 a week. Too little, too late, in my view. Yeah. So, Andrew Giles has to go. He just has to go. This immigration minister is terrible in Parliament, but more importantly, is terrible in the decisions that he is making. Now, as you know, they knew how many people were in detention. That's the thing about when people are in detention. You can count how many there are, but we had to pretend, we don't know, maybe 20, maybe 30, it's 100 and what? And we all know how many of these people had serious criminal records. We also know about the number that have gone on to be accused of criminal offences since being released. And of course, there is the legal argument about whether the case of one person getting the right judgment means all of them had to go, or whether you go the long way around and make every single one of them go back for the same scenario. But don't forget, This is the immigration minister who had previously spoken about how his heart wasn't in it when it came to turnbacks, a bit like Albo. This is the bloke who basically wanted to be the immigration minister because his focus pre-election was all about racism and educating the Australian public about that. But the reality is that he hasn't even used his own laws to apply for one of these people to go back into detention, which is why Peter Dutton is saying this.
This minister has to go.
Order.
This weak Prime Minister needs to show leadership and get rid of...
Resume your seat.
Christy, it's obvious he has to go, but any government that hasn't had to sack is going to hold on for way too long. Well, guess what they're doing? Well, like every other government, they're holding on way too long before they get rid of their first one.
And of course, with the by-election coming up on the 2nd of March, Labor needs to present we're a united team, we know what we're doing, we're on track. They can't afford any gaps. And Peter Dutton has found the gap with Andrew Giles, and he zeroed in on it with laser focus. That does two things. That demonstrates the Albanese government's team is not led by competent front benchers when they're lasered in on and they're held to scrutiny at a time when the Prime Minister's not getting cut through himself. So his umbrella overarching effect is not as strong as it once was. And it does another thing. It takes the focus off the government trying to sell the tax cuts with the impending $40 million. But we all know they've started this massive sales job without it. So it dilutes the message for the government, and it really has let Peter Dutton show his chops. We know that policy has failed. We know the government let Australia down on that immigration debacle. One, the Attorney-General was not taking the advice from the Australian government's solicitor. His eye was off the ball. He was locked in a room writing legislation for a referendum that was never coming to pass. Two, Andrew Giles clearly wasn't doing his job properly either. And three, the Prime Minister wasn't doing his, and there's Claire O'Neill in there somewhere as well.
Well, exactly. And I mean, it's this thing, Joe, where the talking point is it's all Peter Dutton's fault, it's Peter Dutton's legislation. Yeah. Come on. Reality is they were arguing before the High Court. They believed that they were going to win, so the most generous version is they did none of the work in case they lost. But you always have to do the work just in case you lose on something as serious as this. But let's get right up to today. I mean, every day this is what's going to happen. Yep. He'll be asked questions he doesn't want to answer, and he won't be able to answer them.
Yeah, I mean, Dutton's obviously very clearly identified the weakest link in the chain here. Again, Claire O'Neill, while she may have dropped the ball on this, I can point to a number of other really good things that she's done as Home Affairs Minister, including coming in and tightening up the visa process as soon as she took power. Again, we all know that I love Albo, and I think he's done a lot of really good things. And so, but you can't really...
We slightly disagree on this.
Well, I know we slightly disagree on it, but again, we'll probably agree on this. When it comes to Andrew Giles, I can't for the life of me think about what good he has done on the black side of the ledger to offset the damage in the red. He was clearly caught napping with this High Court decision. It has since emerged that this was actually flagged by a judge who said, look, just so you know, read between the lines here, I am looking at coming down on the side of this applicant because they can only be detained on the assumption that they're going to be removed, and I can't see any situation under which this person's going to be removed. Do you get what I am saying to you? If I stamp on your foot and say, hello, Mr. Thompson, you say hello. And there were also a number of meetings about this where he was, I think, overseas or away or anyway, doing voice stuff. And again, I support the voice, but that's a terrible look. The immigration minister's job is to look after what is the most dangerous and volatile and damaging portfolio in any Labor government. And the only benefit to him not being removed, because I don't think Albo will, because he's a very loyal person, is that...
it's not loyalty, it's self-preservation. He didn't sack Katie Gallagher when she misled the Senate, when she lied.
No, I know, that's right, but it would have been...
So it's not about loyalty, it's just about arse covering.
No, this is the whole thing. Like, if he was a more transactional person, he would have said, look, you're dragging me down. This is not playing well for him. He is trying to get out on the tax cuts. If he just chopped Andrew Giles' head off, it would probably go better for him and he'd look strong and decisive, but he hangs on to these
So
people.
we suffer because he's just damn good.
Look, it might not be the right decision for a Prime Minister.
Okay.
But geez, it makes him a good bloke.
I'm tapping out here. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Christy. All right, Megyn Kelly joins us straight after the break. She'll fire up about plenty, including Meghan Markle has a new podcast deal, which is great because we'll have fun things to talk about. But Megyn, as we know, not a huge fan. Well, of course, our favourite person to talk to each and every week, and the reason we're in HD, is none other than the wonderful Megyn Kelly, joining us from the United States. How are you, Rockstar?
I'm so good. How are you?
Doing my best, doing my best. Now, I'm stuck back in, 1970s colour TV is good for me. HD is good for you, right? That's sort of the way the technology should work. Now, look.
Depends on the day.
Yeah. Before we get to politics and all the rest of it, can we just talk about one of our favourite subjects, that being, your old mate Meghan Markle? Now, I noticed today, and there's all this website stuff, but I noticed today that she's announced a brand new podcast deal, right? And it just got me thinking about, the princess in our life, you. Now, you started your own thing. You've built your own thing into millions of people around the world. Why can't she build something? She's just got to get paid by somebody else all the time.
Yeah, it's so true. And no one's ever heard of this podcast outlet that she's going to. As far as I could tell, they've got far, far lefties like Sarah Silverman and Samantha Bee, who are loathed by everybody who is center or right of center. So this is what she's signing up for. She's declaring she's not just liberal or progressive. She's a far left progressive. Those are her new partners. Yeah, she can't build it because no one will come. She tried that. Let me tell you, from Spotify to this Lemonada is a big fall down. She knows that. She couldn't get anybody else to pony up the dough. She needs cold, hard cash because she wants to fly private and she wants all the trappings of the royal life without having to work for it. And she does want to fly private, and she is flying private on everyone else's dime. At the same time, as part of their rebrand, Harry's continuing to touting himself as an environmentalist. Okay, if you're an environmentalist, get on JetBlue. Stop with the private flights everywhere, because that's the only way they'll travel. And of course, she, another hypocrite, is calling herself a feminist who's going to shape the future. How? Because no one tuned into your first crappy podcast where all you did was lecture us on feminism and everyone hated it. Remember, she was so upset that she was objectified when she put on the tiny sparkly dresses on Deal or No Deal, and they didn't want to hear her thoughts on nuclear codes. So it's a joke. She's not a feminist. She's only a Meghanist. That's it. She cares about promoting one thing, herself. Just ask Katie Wadey, as she referred to Kate Middleton in her interview with Oprah, a low blow hit. Or ask Omid Scobie, Meghan's stenographer, who took way below the belt hits at Kate in the book he just put out. She only likes one woman. It's herself. She wasn't very good to the Queen, and now her partner in life, Harry, finds an opportunity to put himself back in the news. We talked about this last week. His father comes down with cancer, and he flies immediately over to the UK. Within 30 seconds, he had released that fact to the media. And even his father at this point is like, get out. He's there for 30 minutes. He insisted reportedly that he not be in the room with Queen Camilla. She's probably the only reason he got the invite to walk in the door anyway. He's called his father a racist. That's back to the Omid Scobie thing. Clearly, those two were telling Omid that Charles is a racist. That was in the book as it was released. And then he tried to take it back. Oh, I never said that to the translator. Well, Omid Scobie did. Anywho, he gets kicked out and he has to go right back home. He had to stay in a hotel. He did fly private for a commercial for that one. They want nothing to do with this pair. And so what we have here is yet another attempt to use the royal name and the royal titles to make money, which is exactly what the Queen asked them not to do. They've launched a new website, a new brand to try to get more money because they think their problem is marketing, is branding. And they refuse, as always, to realize it's them. There's no amount of rebrand that's going to help them.
It doesn't matter how much glitter they decide to roll it in, it still is something nobody wants to buy. Nobody wants to read, and whatever fascination they have are in lives in the past. And the thing that they don't get, I think that they don't understand, particularly say about podcasts, video, all the rest of it, right? Unless you're going to be really, proper open about your life, right? Like that sort of reality level, okay, too much information, or let us into the madness of your life, then that's not particularly interesting. And they're not really people that anyone would consider particularly insightful, or dare I say, sort of, public intellectuals to actually tune into okay, how are they going to help my life? Like, these are not, Jordan Peterson-like people.
Oh, God. She didn't even mention them in the same breath. So you're exactly right.
Just trying to
they
trigger
have
you.
no insightful commentary to offer on anything. No one wants to hear, unless they're going to be talking about the royal family, which is how they got their Netflix deal. And it was interesting. You know, we wanted to see the behind the scenes stuff about the Queen and so on. No one's going to listen. So if they're going to talk about their lives and their thoughts on life, it's going to be more banalities. That's what we got the first time around. No one actually cares about what Meghan Markle thinks about X or Y or Z. We just want to hear them talk about the Queen and what it's like to be a royal. Now they're out of that material, so we're going to be stuck with more lectures on which words we're not allowed to use, according to who? Meghan Markle. Who cares what she thinks about what words I attempt to use in my life? Couldn't care less. This is why Spotify wanted to get rid of them. This is why they were called the greatest grifters of all time by Bill Simmons over at Spotify. They didn't live up to their deal. They weren't producing more content for Netflix. All these deals are circling the drain. So they went to the no-name far-left organization that signed her up. I guess we're going to get more drivel on feminism, according to Meghan Markle, who's done nothing other than get married. That's her big accomplishment. Fine, I like being married, but it's not like that's what a feminist does. We get married and then we tell everybody about what we did as a married woman thanks to our husband's money. Woo, me!
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, as important as marriage is, and obviously happy Valentine's Day, here it is in Australia from those who love you here,
Yes.
but it's not landing on the moon. You know, like it's like when these people get, it's like, you know, that's something that, okay, wow, really? Only this many? And how many? But, you know, anyway. Now, The View. Sunny Houston is one of the most annoying people on the most annoying show on television in the US. And she's all about, you know, the far left stuff and racism and institutional racism. She does one of these tests and, oh, what's in her past?
I was really reluctant to do it because I just sensed that there could be something in my family history that would be disappointing. But what I found out was that my mother's family, while they are Puerto Rican, they actually originate from Spain. And the reason that they moved to Puerto Rico is because the slave trade had been sort of canceled in Spain and then Curacao, and then they moved all of their slaves to Puerto Rico. And so the family business, I had been told that they were printers and journalists, but they were in fact enslavers.
Yes, it turns out her mother is white, which she claims she didn't know, and she's descended from slave owners. It's amazing. She's been ripping on the United States and our terrible past, and she's been demanding reparations for, you know, modern day Black Americans, many of whom had absolutely no connection whatsoever to slaves or slavery, but still they need to get paid. And it turns out she's going to have to pay out. She's not receiving anything. She's going to have to pay it out. She says she stands by her demand. She wants the reparations paid. Okay, Sonny, you first. She lives in a multi-million-dollar house. She has a multi-million-dollar job. Her son is at Harvard, I'm sure, because of her connections and her top-notch education that she provided him in private school, undoubtedly. And she still thinks the country's unfair and needs to pay reparations to modern-day American Black people. So it turns out that Sonny's mother, who she thought was Puerto Rican, is white. And she was not, she thought she was Black and Puerto Rican, and she's not. She's from Spain originally, and she's white. Those are Sonny's words and Sonny's conclusions after going on with Henry Louis Gates, who does, you know, this show on your ancestry. And she's talking openly about how disappointed she is and how she wished, this is why she never wanted to get this done, because she knew she would just be horrified if this were the case, because her mother had blonde hair and is lighter skinned and has blue eyes. The horror that she might turn out to be white, the disgusting white race for a mom. I mean, it's the only Sunny Houston or somebody like that in the American left can get away with this kind of talk. Can you imagine a white person being like, never wanted to have my ancestry checked because I was really worried I might have that one drop of Black blood in me. The horror, I never, oh my God, I'm disappointed, I'm horrified. You would be an obvious racist and called out appropriately. This is not even a footnote in the media that she said any of this.
Megyn, so good to talk to you. Let's do it again next week.
The pleasure's mine. See you soon.
All right, we're done for tonight. Here comes the late debate, and I can tell you they are on song literally singing in preparation for tonight's show. See you tomorrow.